Hello guys, Vaprab here, back again with another Assetto Corsa rally video. Today, I'll show you how I create my own custom configurations for the different cars. It does not really matter whether you're a beginner or an experienced sim racer, because a game like Assetto Corsa Rally demands precision. This is a game which is all about rally simulation, so you would really need your own custom configurations in order to chase higher ranks in the world leaderboards. Today, I'll show you how I create my own so that you can follow along and create your own custom configurations. I'll give you the basic rule of thumb that you can follow and create your own custom configuration and have a strong base for the different cars that are there in this game. Today, for showing the custom configurations for the cars, I would choose a car like a four-wheel drive car, mostly like a Skoda Fabia or a Lancia Delta, so that there are more options in there that can be covered. Mark my words that a custom configuration is absolutely necessary in order to achieve better ranks in the world leaderboards. The main nuance in this game is that even if you copy others' custom configurations that others might have used in order to achieve good placement in the world leaderboards, it might not work for you. In order to get good rank in the world leaderboards, you do need to create your own custom configurations. The reason being, one custom configuration might work well for some persons, but it is not universal, so it will not be working for everybody. You really do need your own custom configurations if you are chasing higher ranks in the world leaderboards. One thing to note is that everybody's sim racing rig is different, and the fact that even if you copy a custom configuration from any other YouTuber, it does not really mean that you will get the same exact result. The reason being, custom configuration might work differently on different sim rig, so you do really need your own custom configurations in order to achieve better ranks in this game. For today's example, I chose the car, the Lancia Delta, since it is my favorite car in the game and it is also a four-wheel drive car. It should cover most of the options in the configurations, and you can apply the similar concept for the other cars. I will give you the most basic rule of thumb in order to create your own custom configurations. If you see, let me go into my car setup and save and load setup. I'll go to the personal setup. You see, there are so many different setups that I have for this car. The thing is, every time I'm able to hit a better time using a particular kind of setup, I will save it and move on to a new one. Every time I'm able to improve my time, I'll save that setup. And let's say the scenario is changed from a dry gravel scenario to a wet gravel scenario. I'll first start with the last best setup that worked for me and then start modifying the configuration from there. That is why I have so many different setups. Let us start with the most unimportant settings for your car configuration. In the electronics and aerodynamics section, you will see something called ABS map and TCS map. These two are only important if you are using ABS or TCS. TCS being traction control. What I have seen through my racing in Assetto Corsa Rally is that if you're having ABS and TCS maps on, you're using either ABS or traction control, generally you are losing time. So preferably I would keep those settings off, and after that these two settings does not really matter. Additional lights are the extra lights that you see on the front of the car, which is necessary mostly in the night stages, but sometimes I prefer to have it on even when, let's say, the rally is set in early morning or in the evening stage where the light is less. It sometimes really helps. Next, let's move on to the brakes. Considering that this is a gravel stage, it is always preferable to have softer brake pads. So generally what I would prefer is a soft brake pad in the front and a medium brake pad in the rear. That gives the best amount of control for four-wheel drive cars. When I move on to a tarmac stage, I'll have medium brake pads in the front and hard brake pads in the rear, in order to not get the brakes locked up on tarmac. You do need harder brakes on the tarmac because you'll be braking harder. And if you're having soft brakes on tarmac, you'll be locking up and you'll be just moving straight. So you'll have a lot of understeer to the car. It will just move on straight even though you're adding steering input. The other part is this brake cylinder part. If you increase the number towards the right, it is actually giving you more brake bite. If you're reducing, it will reduce the amount of braking power. The front bias and the front bias over here, actually it gives you the braking power considering the front brakes and the rear brakes. If you're having too much front braking and too less rear braking, you will have oversteer. And if you're having too much rear bias, you will be having understeer and you will be moving straight even though you're providing steering input. So this is what you have to balance in order to get a good score and better car stability. Handbrake force, generally I keep it somewhere around the value of 80, because in this game you have to be very, very nimble on the handbrake. If you're overdoing it, you're just turning or spinning the car and you might just lose the car on the track. So it is always preferable to have a lower force on the handbrakes. Next, let's move on to the wheels. If you see, whenever you hover above these options, it will show you what exactly the changes over here will affect on the car. So let's say you're on a gravel stage. People will generally prefer a lower pressure, but what I have seen is if you're starting out with lower pressures, you're losing time in the beginning of the stage, and by the end of the stage you have already lost quite some time when your pressure is optimum. So I prefer to start on a higher pressure because that gives you optimum grip from the beginning of the stage. It also does mean that you have less grip towards the end of the stage, but by that time you have gained a lot of time, and that actually helps you gaining more time. So let's say I'm having the Lancia car, I would generally prefer to have it on 34 for the front and 34 for the back. This gives you optimum pressure on the tires in gravel. Also, if you see the toe angles is the angle by which the wheels are either pointing towards the inside or pointing towards the outside when you're driving. See, if I'm hovering over the toe, it is giving me the options like how the toe in or toe out will affect the car. So whatever options is here, like say they are saying for a four-wheel drive car, it's always preferable to have a toe in for the front and toe out for the rear. And this gives you the best grip and stability for the cars. And that is what I generally follow. Also, if you see this FBB player multiplier, I think this is a new option that they added in the version V0.3. I think this just multiplies the force feedback on the steering wheel, because there are cars where you feel the force feedback much less compared to other cars. So this is the option where you can actually change. One being the force feedback settings that you have set in your input section, and then whatever you increase, it will just multiply that. So it increases the force feedback that you're getting from the car, depending on how the car is responding to your inputs. Next, let's move on to differentials. This is an important part in Assetto Corsa Rally, and they have given a lot of options here that you can modify. Generally, what I have seen is with higher differential ratios, you are able to achieve higher speeds at lower gears. the opposite is true when you're choosing a lower differential ratio. For me, I generally prefer a higher differential ratio because that means I will have lesser gear changes, which actually saves time when you're trying to push for a higher rank in the world leaderboards. I keep this option. I have not touched this option so much, center ratio to the rear. This actually would provide extra power to your rear differentials. I have not tried this so much, but for the central differential ratio, I generally prefer a higher differential ratio. The LHD power coast ramp, it is what keeps your differential open or closed, meaning that if you're having higher LHD power and coast ramp, your car will be less responsive, but at the same time it will provide greater stability. Same is true for LHD preload. LHD preload is the minimum torque that is required in order for the differentials to either work independently of each other or work together in tandem. Preferably, I keep it at a higher preload, because that makes sure that the wheels are rotating together, even for the rear. But it is always advisable to have a little lower LHD preload in the front compared to the rear. That would make sure that the front is snappy, but the rear is stable. For the plates number, what I have seen through my racing is that the lower the plates number, the more unpredictable the car is at the front or even at the back. So generally I prefer a higher plates number even for the front and the back in Assetto Corsa Rally. Next, let's move on to the axles. The anti-roll bar stiffness. This determines how stiff or how loose your car is. So if you have if the value is lesser, your car would tend to roll more, and if the value is higher, your car will stay stable. What I would recommend is you try and match both of this anti-roll bar stiffness for the front and rear as closely as possible. Let's say I'm using 15500 here, but don't go by the number. See the space after this red dot. You try and match it similarly, and that would give you the best car configuration with respect to the axles, give you the highest amount of stability, so that neither there is a lot of roll nor there is too much stiffness. But generally I would prefer it on a higher number than what is generally presented in the default configuration, and try and match both of these two numbers. Does not have to be the numbers exactly, but the position where this the arrow, not the arrow, this dot is for these two options. Next, let's move on to the dampers. Don't get overwhelmed by so many numbers over here. I know it is it is intimidating, but don't be afraid. It's quite simple. Let me explain in a very simple method. The lower the value you have, the more bumps and jumps your car is going to have. The higher the value, the more stable the car. But the problem is when you're traveling at speed on an undulating surface, your car will be jumping more if everything is very, very stiff. Preferably for a gravel track, what I do is select some value in the middle and try and match all the numbers below. I mean, not the numbers, at least the position of this dot for all the options. And then after you have matched similarly over here, you will do the same thing for the rear as well. You try and match all the values. This, what I have seen, has given me the highest amount of car stability and ensure that I am able to carry higher speed through corners in a gravel stage. For a tarmac stage, you can go with higher values. You can go with stiffer values. But make sure that you're using higher tire pressures or else you'll be hitting the corners or the curbs, and that might make your cars unstable. I would easily use a value like this for a tarmac stage. Let's move on to the suspensions. The adjuster ring over here is actually the ground clearance for the car. So higher the value, the more higher your car is from the ground. Generally what I have seen, you go faster with lower value. Generally somewhere around 700, 600 is already good enough for gravel. If you're on tarmac, you can lower this also by a little bit more. But also one more thing is the adjuster ring for both the front and rear is preferable to have similar values, because you don't want the front to be too low and the back to be too high. That also makes your car unstable. So you have to match these two values as closely as possible. The spring stiffness is the stiffness of your suspension. Higher the stiffness, more jumps and bumps. Lower the stiffness, smoother is the ride. But if your stiffness is a little too smooth, you will be losing speed, because your car won't be able to achieve higher speed as the springs are adjusting to the undulations of the road. So it is also preferable to have a little bit higher spring stiffness in order to get higher speeds. Let's say for the rear they have already chosen 4000. It looks similar values. If the value even is not similar, but you see the dots for the rear, you adjust for the front. And that is how mostly I adjust my car configuration when it comes to suspensions. Let's come to the gearbox. This is the last option. Having lower gear ratios will ensure that you're having faster gear changes. At the same time, the higher the ratios, you're having slower gear changes, but at the same time you're achieving higher speeds. Generally what I prefer is a middle ground, because I prefer a higher differential ratio. What will happen if you're having a lower gear set is you're already through the gears and you're not achieving your high speed. So your high speed is achieved at only the highest gear. On the contrary, when you're having a higher gear set, you're achieving higher speeds on lower gear. So let's say I'm choosing gear set 1. Let's say the gear 6 over here is comparable to gear 4 in gear set 3. That is how the gear set affects the car. I generally prefer to have a mid ground in the gear sets, as I prefer to drive on a higher differential ratio. Now for a few pointers. For 4-wheel drive car, what I have seen is you can keep the same pressure both for the front and rear wheels. That gives actually the highest amount of grip and speed for 4-wheel drive cars. When it comes to the front wheel drive car, it is preferable to have higher pressure in the front wheel and lower pressure in the rear wheel. And the opposite is true when it comes to rear wheel drive cars. When it comes to rear wheel drive cars, I will keep higher pressures on the rear wheels and lower pressure in the front wheel. That gives you the maximum amount of stability for those cars, because the rear wheel drive cars are generally very tail happy. You need higher pressures. If you're having lower pressures in the back, the back of the car will lose stability. When it comes to differentials, what I have seen is that choosing a higher differential ratio has actually always given me higher speeds at lower gears, and generally that is what I would prefer for even tarmac and gravel, because that would mean I would need fewer number of gear changes in order to achieve higher speed. and that saves a lot of time, even if that seems small, but cumulatively it adds up. Now you can try out the basic concepts of a custom car configurations that I have shown here and try it out on the different cars that are there in this game. The basic concepts apply to all the cars. So happy racing. That is it, the basic car configurations. Now you can try out whatever I have suggested and create your own custom configurations for the different cars. Mark my words, you do need your own custom configurations in order to achieve higher ranks in the world leaderboards, without which it's impossible. You might be able to scrape through goals, but getting higher ranks, it's going to be difficult. And don't copy others' configurations, as it might not suit well to your custom rig, because every racing simulation rig is different from one another. So you really do need to use your own custom configurations and see how the car really drives. Also, before trying out the custom configuration, one fine point would be to actually try out the car using the default configuration. That way you would know how the car drives and you can make the changes according to your own liking. That does it for this video. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you guys in the future again, and keep racing. Let's hit the road.